The sun over the Gabès Road burned low and harsh, a dull red disk sinking through layers of dust thick enough to turn the air opaque. It was 1630 hours. The wind had died, leaving the powder-fine sand suspended in a copper haze. Through it, the outlines of wrecked trucks and gutted tanks shimmered like ghosts. This was the last act of the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, starving and bleeding, still fought with the precision of habit. Every round was counted. Every gun was positioned to kill once and then run. In a shallow wadi just west of the coastal road, a German 88mm anti-tank gun crouched under camouflage, netting the color of dried tobacco. The crew belonged to the 10th Panzer Division, veterans of Kasserine and El Guettar. They were waiting for movement across the open flats, American Shermans coming up from the south in their usual formation, big, tall, visible miles away, as they always were. The loader, Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Mader, leaned over the sighting scope, tracing arcs of mirage heat. Nothing moved. Then, at 400 meters, something appeared where there had been nothing. A grey-beige shadow flickered into focus, too square to be a dune, too broad to be a truck. Before the gun captain could shout correction, a muzzle flash split the dust. The 88 never fired. The shell from the American gun hit low on the carriage, shearing the breech from its cradle and throwing the German crew backward in a cloud of sand. When the survivors crawled up from the blast, the tank was gone. No smoke, no dust trail. Gone. Weeks later, Mader would tell his American interrogators in a makeshift tent outside Sfax. It was in the open. We had clear sight. Then it was gone. Not behind a hill. Gone. His words, recorded in U.S. Army Combat Interrogation, number T-4317, became one of the earliest documented signs that something had changed in the visual war of North Africa. Something about the way American tanks looked or didn't look. By the spring of 1943, the Afrika Korps was dying on its feet. The German army had no fuel to maneuver and no replacement parts for its tanks. Ammunition was rationed, air cover dwindled, and every engagement had become a desperate ambush. Yet morale held because of one enduring faith, that an 88 could always find its mark. The American Sherman was tall, boxy, and easily read against the pale sands. Its standard olive-drab skin was a painter's dream of a target. Under full sun, the tanks appeared almost black perfect silhouettes for the sights of German gunners who had learned to hunt them by color alone. That certainty died on the Gabès Road, the Shermans of the U.S. 1st Armoured Division rolling that afternoon did not wear factory olive drab. Their surfaces were dull, streaked, uneven, washed out to the color of Tunisian dust. At a distance they seemed sun-bleached, half the tone of the landscape, their contours swallowed by glare. To the trained eye of the German gunner, they looked wrong. The familiar green-black block of a Sherman had become a chalked, ashen ghost. Nothing in any Allied manual had ordered this transformation. No engineer in Detroit had designed it. It was, in every sense, an accident. The crews had done it themselves. Months of fighting in desert light had taught them a brutal lesson. Shine kills. The olive-drab finish, so carefully applied at the factory, reflected the sun like glass under North African skies. The first crew to change that did it out of exhaustion and fear, not ingenuity. They mixed desert dust with oil leaking from their engines and smeared the paste over the glacis plates and turrets. It dulled the shine, killed the glare, and soon enough every tank in their platoon did the same. Others followed. Some used dried clay scooped from wadis, some powdered limestone from road crews. Some rubbed the paint with rags soaked in spilled gasoline, until the surface turned chalky and grey. There were no orders, only imitation and superstition. If the tank beside yours survived, you copied what its crew had done. No one yet understood what they had created. They were not just changing the colour, they were erasing the tank's geometry. Sunlight no longer slid cleanly over smooth armour. It broke into irregular blotches of pale and dark, imitating the play of shadow across sand. The high silhouette still existed, but the human eye trained to seek edges and contrast lost its anchor. The tank ceased to read as a machine. It became terrain. German spotters began reporting washed tanks, vehicles that seemed to shimmer or fade into dust until they moved. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs, once sharp enough to pick out tank platoons in convoy, started showing faint shapes barely distinguishable from roadbed or rubble. The reports were dismissed at first. Commanders blamed poor light or bad film exposure. But the pattern grew. To the Americans in the field, it was immediate and practical. The new look saved lives. Crews noticed that German gunners were slower to engage. The first shell came later, sometimes not at all. In a war of seconds, that hesitation was survival. By April of 1943, a company commander in the 13th Armoured Regiment wrote in an after-action note, "Recommend all tanks be dulled with local dust and lime. New arrivals too, dark, visibility extreme." It was not a technical report. It was a plea from men who had seen friends burn. Headquarters never issued a formal directive, but no one stopped them either. Field practice became unofficial policy. From a distance, a line of Shermans on the move now looked like a string of dunes rolling forward. The contrast between turret and hull melted away. The dust they raised served as their own smoke screen, folding back into the same color as their hulls. German optics could no longer cleanly fix them before the first shot. The hunters were losing their edge. Captured correspondence from German officers in the region speaks with disbelief. One complained that the Americans have painted their tanks yellow like the desert. Another reported that our forward guns fire only when the tanks are already firing. It was as if the desert itself had turned against. To them, hiding the enemy it had once exposed. The transformation was not aesthetic. It was mathematical. Combat analysts on both sides began recording a measurable change. An unprecedented difficulty in early visual acquisition of American armor beyond 600 meters in open ground. At that range, seconds meant everything. The side that saw first, fired first, lived. The side that saw second, died. In a war obsessed with industrial might, with horsepower, armor thickness, and gun caliber, this new factor was invisible in the statistics. It was dust and oil, applied by hand, curing under the sun. Yet its effect rippled outward, altering the balance of sight and death across a continent. The Sherman that killed the 88 on the Gabès Road should have died that afternoon. By every prior rule of desert warfare, it was too exposed, too close, too slow to hide. But as the light fell and the dust settled, the only trace left was the twisted wreckage of the German gun and a fading impression of tracks leading nowhere. The rest was silence. From that silence began a quiet revolution, a realization that camouflage was not decoration, but physics. It was time and distance converted into survival. What began as grime on a tank's hull would soon rewrite the equations of armored war from Tunisia to Normandy. In the final hours of daylight, when the wind rose again and the wadi filled with dust, the battlefield became a blur of tan and shadow. The German prisoners would remember it as the moment when the desert itself decided to hide the enemy. The Americans just called it luck. But luck, in North Africa, had a color, and it was the color of dust. The story of the disappearing Shermans might have ended as rumor and oddity buried in interrogation files and combat notes, if not for what happened 11 days later. On the morning of April 18, 1943, north of Maknassi, Tunisia, reconnaissance aircraft from the 9th Air Force photographed a German armored column retreating toward Enfidaville. When analysts reviewed the images that evening, they saw something stranger than the retreat. American tanks parked in full daylight, less than a kilometer from open road, undetected by enemy spotters. They were visible only as faint smudges on the film, indistinguishable from the dust shadows of the ridgeline. That photographic evidence triggered what the U.S. Army called an urgent technical inquiry. The Army Ordnance Department, accustomed to thinking in terms of steel and ballistics, suddenly found itself studying sand. The initial reports from the 1st Armored Division's field workshops described the change in simple words. Local coating, applied by crew, mixture of earth dust and oil. Effect: reduces glare, reduces contrast, improves concealment. No one wrote camouflage yet. The word carried the whiff of paintbrushes and artists. But officers in Tunisia began to understand that what their crews were doing with rags and road dust was as important as any factory innovation. In the forward command tent near Spietler, Colonel Louis Hightower, commanding officer of the 13th Armoured Regiment, convened an informal test. He ordered 2 tanks from B Company to be parked in identical terrain, one in factory olive, drab, freshly washed, the other rubbed with local clay and limestone dust. He invited observers from both British 8th Army and U.S. Army Air Forces to identify which tank appeared first through binoculars at 800 meters. The result was decisive. The olive-drab tank stood out immediately. The dusted Sherman disappeared until the spotter was within 400 meters, and even then its shape wavered with mirage. The British liaison officer present, Captain Peter O'Malley of the Royal Engineers, wrote a short memorandum afterward. This effect recalls certain field practices in the Western Desert, where we dulled Bren carriers with chalk dust to blend them with terrain. Americans appear to have rediscovered the principle by accident. Recommend formal adoption. That memo circulated quietly through 8th Army channels, but it was the American reaction that mattered most. Within 2 weeks, the practice of dust coating spread across 1st Armored Division as unofficial gospel. For the men who lived inside those steel boxes, the logic was visceral. Visibility meant death. When a German 88 fired, the first shell was usually the last. A tank crew that survived one engagement learned to fear sunlight more than enemy gunners, so they experimented. Some rubbed their hulls with used engine oil mixed with sand to create dull streaks that broke up outlines. Others collected powdered limestone from road crews, shaking it over wet paint to achieve a faded finish. A few platoons scavenged discarded tarps from British depots and cut them into irregular nets dyed with tea or soot. None of it was regulation. All of it worked. By late April, German field reports began noting reduced detectability of Allied armour. A message intercepted by British codebreakers from Panzer Army Africa described enemy tanks in desert coloration, difficult to observe until firing. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but the undertone was alarm. For an army that prided itself on marksmanship and precision, losing the advantage of sight was catastrophic. The irony was that American engineers had spent months trying to design camouflage in laboratories back home, controlled tests, color swatches, chemical paints. None of it had matched the accidental brilliance of grime. What the desert crews discovered was a psychological truth. Perfect camouflage is not a single color, but the absence of certainty. The Germans could not decide what they were seeing, so they hesitated. That hesitation bought the Shermans seconds. Seconds became victories. At the same time, another branch of the U.S. Army was paying close attention the Air Corps. Pilots from the 12th Air Force, flying low-level support missions for the advancing ground forces, reported that they too had trouble identifying friendly tanks. From 2,000 feet, the washed Shermans blended with terrain so effectively that pilots occasionally mistook them for wrecks or shadows. For once, that confusion worked in favor of the ground troops. Friendly fire incidents dropped, and close air support became more aggressive. It was Captain Harlan K. Morris, a young ordnance officer attached to 13th Corps, who first suggested formalizing what he called the dust finish. In a field report dated April 27, 1943, he wrote, "Recommend all armored vehicles operating in desert environment apply dust suspension derived from local material. Method: rub surface with sackcloth soaked in waste oil, then cover with pulverized limestone or equivalent. Effect: visual distortion beyond 600 meters. No interference with mechanical operation." His phrasing was dry, but what he proposed was revolutionary. A doctrine of invisibility built not from technology but from adaptation. By May, copies of Morris's report reached Algiers and, from there, Washington. The Army's Bureau of Ordnance circulated an internal bulletin titled Field Concealment Practices North Africa, summarizing observations without claiming authorship. Paragraph 3 reads simply, "It is advised that units employ local materials to reduce surface reflectivity and match terrain coloration. Uniform appearance is less important than disruption of form." Those sentences, written in bureaucratic monotone, marked the birth of a principle that would guide Allied armor through Italy, France, and beyond. The Germans were slower to understand what had happened. To them, the disappearance of Allied tanks seemed almost supernatural. Luftwaffe reconnaissance crews complained of invisible convoys. In captured diaries from panzer units, soldiers spoke of ghost columns that appeared out of dust storms. Superstition began to creep into the rational calculus of war. By June, a psychological report filed by the German 14th Army in Italy included the phrase, "fear of unseen enemy armor." What had begun as an accident of dust and oil was now shaping morale on both sides. The tank that should have been dead on April 7th had become the template for an army that could appear or vanish at will. Behind every technological leap in warfare lies a human story of improvisation. On that scorched road outside Gabès, a handful of exhausted men had taken their survival into their own hands. They didn't know they were making history. They only knew they were tired of dying in green paint under a white sun. The desert gave them the answer: powder, clay, and the dull wisdom of necessity. By the time the Africa Corps surrendered in May 1943, American tank units were already experimenting with permanent paint mixtures to replicate the accidental miracle. They called it desert pink, a pale tan mixed with chalk dust, officially coded as camouflage color number 12. But no laboratory formula ever matched the raw, living camouflage born in the dust of Tunisia. In those final weeks, as German prisoners trudged past lines of Shermans half buried in sand, many glanced at them with unease. The tanks seemed to merge with the earth, their edges soft, their shadows gone. The men who once laughed at the clumsy American machines could no longer see where the machines ended and the desert began. And somewhere, in a captured tent near Sfax, a U.S. intelligence officer filed Obergefreiter Mader's strange testimony under Camouflage Miscellaneous. He could not have known it yet, but the age of the vanishing tank had begun. Dawn came late over the Sicilian coast. The light filtered through smoke from burning oil tanks and the spray of surf pounding against the landing craft. It was July 10th, 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. For weeks, soldiers had whispered that this assault would be the true test of everything learned in North Africa. The lessons of dust and glare would now meet new terrain, white limestone cliffs, olive groves, and villages the color of bone. The first waves of landing craft churned toward the beaches near Gela and Licata. Inside them, U.S. tank crews of the 1st Armored Division braced against the motion, their vehicles secured under canvas covers streaked with chalky residue. The crews had done the unthinkable during staging in Tunisia. They had deliberately ruined their tank's finish. Using powdered limestone, crushed coral, and road dust mixed with used engine oil, they had created a pale, uneven coat that looked nothing like the deep olive drab from the Detroit factories. Under the Mediterranean sun, the tanks looked bleached and ancient, as if carved from the same stone that ringed the Sicilian coast. When the ramps dropped, sea-water rushed in, hissing against steel that had already turned the color of sand. The first Shermans rolled ashore through knee-deep water. Italian observers posted along the dunes radioed that infantry and trucks were landing, but no tanks. The deception lasted only minutes, yet those minutes mattered. German artillery batteries, expecting the distinctive green silhouettes of American armor, held fire. By the time they realized their mistake, the Shermans were already inland, climbing the dunes and returning fire. That morning became the baptism of the desert wash in Europe. What had begun as a Prusse survival trick in Tunisia now revealed itself as a weapon. The German defenders at Gela, veterans of the Hermann Göring Division, later reported in interrogation that the Americans brought sand-colored tanks, same shade as our own Dunkelgelb, and nearly impossible to see in the rubble. To those German crews, the shock was psychological as well as tactical. For 2 years, they had been told that American industry could produce quantity but not sophistication. Now they faced an enemy that had matched their camouflage and done it better. On the beaches, the effect was almost surreal. Allied air spotters circling above struggled to distinguish friend from foe. From altitude, the battlefield was a patchwork of grey-white rock and moving tan shapes. The difference between a Sherman and a Sicilian stone wall was visible only when the tank fired. Pilots described the phenomenon in radio chatter with awe and unease. Hard to see the armor. They're blending into everything. In the chaos of the landings, Colonel Louis Hightower, still commanding elements of the 13th Armored Regiment, realized the advantage. He ordered all arriving tanks to remain dirty, no washing, no repainting, no attempt to clean the dust that caked the hulls from transport. His reasoning was simple. The filth saved lives. Under fire, shine was death, dullness was survival. The crews obeyed with enthusiasm, some even throwing handfuls of beach sand over their turrets before rolling forward. Local civilians watched in astonishment as these strange, pale tanks advanced through their villages. Children later recalled that the machines looked like moving stones rather than armored beasts. Italian propaganda had promised that American tanks would be monstrous and dark, symbols of mechanical tyranny. What appeared instead were ghostly vehicles that blended into the sun-drenched streets. The contrast between expectation and reality disarmed more than soldiers it undermined morale among the defenders. By the third day of the invasion, American reconnaissance units had captured several German anti-tank positions intact. The after-action reports were clear. Many enemy gunners had waited too long to fire. In one case, near Nisemi, a German 88 crew had passed over a Sherman platoon, moving along a ridge, mistaking them for wrecks until the tanks opened fire. The difference between life and death was measured in seconds of visual confusion. The Allied command noticed. Engineers attached to the British 8th Army conducted controlled tests comparing factory-painted Shermans to field-treated ones under Sicilian light. The washed tanks reduced detection range by nearly half. The results reached General Patton's headquarters within days. His response, scribbled on a memo margin, read simply, "Keep them dirty." As the campaign pressed inland, the chalk-coated armor adapted further. Crews began mixing local dust and olive oil from captured farms into their makeshift paint. The resulting hue was warm and matte, matching the rolling hills and wheat fields. Photographs from July and August show columns of Shermans that appear almost camouflaged by accident soft edges, pale streaks, turret shadows that dissolve into the background. For the first time, American armor moved through European countryside with stealth rather than brute visibility. The German response was telling. Radio intercepts captured messages from Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, complaining that enemy armor now resembles terrain, difficult to photograph. Pilots flying Mi-109s described strafing stone-colored targets that turned out to be farmhouses. Confusion spread upward through the chain of command. Orders were issued to engage any suspicious movement, regardless of color. But by then, the Allies had learned to use that confusion as camouflage's final weapon uncertainty. It was not only the color that mattered. The new practice introduced an understanding of context. Tank crews no longer thought of camouflage as something painted once at the factory. It was something alive, something to be remade whenever the ground changed. When it rained, they let mud dry unevenly on the hulls. When the roads turned to dust, they brushed it upward onto the turrets. Each environment demanded its own disguise. British observers called it adaptive dulling. Americans, less formal, called it desert dressing. Whatever the name, it transformed the relationship between tank and terrain. The machine was no longer an intruder on the battlefield, it became part of it. On July 24th, during fighting near Palermo, German artillerymen described a tank emerging from rubble as if built from it. That image, steel born from stone, captured the essence of the accidental revolution that had begun months earlier in Tunisia. The Americans were learning not just to fight in the landscape, but to become the landscape. When Sicily fell in August, Allied commanders held a quiet conference at Syracuse to review lessons. Among the topics, naval coordination, logistics, air cover was a new entry: effect of field camouflage on armor survivability. The report concluded, in uncharacteristically poetic language for a military document, that the dust of the earth is the best armor paint in the world. No order was issued to change factory colors. Bureaucracy moved too slowly for that. But every tank crew leaving for the next campaign knew what to do. In Italy's mountains and mud, in France's hedgerows, even on the coral beaches of the Pacific, they would carry the same unspoken doctrine born of desperation and sand: kill the shine, blur the shape, let the world hide you. What began as grime and limestone had crossed the sea as a weapon. The tanks that once glared under the African sun now rolled through Europe like moving ghosts, armored by nothing more than dust and common sense. The enemy still had guns and skill, but for the first time since the war began, they had lost sight. The rain had fallen for 3 straight days across the Italian peninsula, turning roads into rivers and fields into mirrors of grey mud. Near the town of Venafro, in the shadow of the Apennines, a column of Shermans from the 1st Armoured Division crept through fog so thick it seemed solid. To the north, German artillery probed the valley, searching for targets. Yet the shells fell wide, exploding harmlessly among trees and stones. The tanks, though in open terrain, were invisible. At first, the crews thought it was luck. Then the pattern repeated, convoys undetected, German fire delayed or misdirected. The same dull, irregular coating that had hidden tanks in desert light now turned them into phantoms under Italian cloud. The accidental camouflage born in Tunisian dust had met its second transformation: mud. The men called it the second skin. Every track of the Shermans was caked with wet clay, every surface streaked by rainwater mixed with soil. The result was an ever-changing pattern of brown and grey that no paint could imitate. Engineers sent from Allied headquarters to observe described the effect as self-camouflaging, a living system in which the environment repainted the machine daily. By late autumn of 1943, the U.S. Army's Corps of Engineers began taking the phenomenon seriously. A research team led by Major Richard D. Hopkins, formerly of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, arrived to document what field soldiers already knew. Their report, Preliminary Observations on Field Camouflage of Armored Vehicles in Variable Terrain, recorded test after test: identical tanks, one cleaned and repainted, one left to the mercy of mud. The dirty one won every time. Hopkins' conclusion was startling in its simplicity. Camouflage is a dynamic condition, not a static finish. He proposed a new doctrine: adaptive concealment, which held that the most effective disguise was not an artificial paint scheme, but the natural accumulation of the battlefield itself. His team noted that tanks which had operated continuously for several weeks, collecting grime, vegetation, and soot, had up to 30% higher survival rates in ambush conditions than freshly delivered replacements. The findings reached Allied command in Naples, just as planning began for the next great push northward, the assault on Monte Cassino. There, in one of the most bitter and complex battles of the war, the science of dirt would become a doctrine of war. On the slopes below Cassino, where the ground was a patchwork of shattered stone, olive groves, and snow, camouflage had to evolve again. The olive-drab tanks from North Africa and Sicily stood out sharply against the winter landscape. At first, commanders ordered a return to factory paint olive-drab overpainted with whitewash. It looked neat in photographs and hopeless in battle. The white chipped under rain, exposing shiny metal and catching the light like a beacon. It was the crews who corrected the error. Instead of painting, they began plastering their tanks with what the land offered: chalk dust, broken plaster from bombed villages, and sheets of canvas rubbed with lime. They called it Cassino Grey. Under overcast skies, the effect was spectral. A German spotter near St. Elia wrote in his diary, "They move like smoke. The tanks come from the mist, not the road." The shift was psychological as well as tactical. The tankers began to think of their machines as alive organisms that needed to breathe, hide, and adapt. Maintenance crews stopped washing vehicles unless absolutely necessary. Mechanics used mud itself to seal gaps in armor seams and deaden shine on replacement parts. The obsession with cleanliness, once a hallmark of military discipline, vanished under a new creed. A dirty tank is a living tank. Hopkins' team followed the Charity, armies northward, gathering field samples, soil, pigments, and even bits of shattered paint to study reflectivity. In early November, they presented their interim report to Allied Forces headquarters. Field camouflage improves survivability by reducing immediate visual acquisition by enemy observers by an average of 6 seconds at 1 kilometer range. 6 seconds. It sounded trivial on paper. On the battlefield, 6 seconds was the difference between being a smouldering wreck and firing first. The Germans noticed the change with growing frustration. A report from the 10th Army's Intelligence Section, dated November 22, 1943, complained that enemy tanks now exhibit no consistent coloration. Observation is unreliable except when moving. Luftwaffe photo interpreters could no longer distinguish between knocked-out and active Allied vehicles from reconnaissance imagery. The landscape itself seemed to conspire to protect the invaders. For the first time, American camouflage began to outpace German science. The Wehrmacht's elaborate color codes, dunkelgelb, olive-grün, rotbraun, were now being defeated not by technology, but by entropy. While the Germans repainted their tanks according to regulation, the Americans simply let nature do the work. The battlefield had become the painter. In December, the transformation reached its peak during the brutal fighting along the Rapido River. Under ceaseless rain and shell fire, American tank units supporting the 36th Infantry Division advanced through flooded fields. Their hulls were so coated with mud and reed that infantrymen joked about riding swamp beasts. German observers never saw them until they fired. Reports from captured enemy officers afterward read like confessions of disbelief. They seemed to rise from the ground itself. By winter's end, the phenomenon could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Headquarters in Algiers drafted the first formal directive, acknowledging field-applied camouflage. Circular A-47, issued January 5, 1944, stated, "Units are authorized to modify external appearance of vehicles using local material as necessary to conform to environment. Standard finish is to be considered provisional." Those last words, "standard finish is provisional," marked a revolution in military thinking. No longer was camouflage a question of design or uniformity. It was a living dialogue between machine and landscape, soldier and survival. When Major Hopkins returned to the United States in early 1944, his team brought crates of Italian mud, Tunisian dust, and Sicilian limestone for laboratory study. The samples told a strange story. None of them shared the same pigment ratio, yet all achieved the same effect: low contrast, high confusion. From chaos came concealment. What had begun as an accident on the Gabès Road had become the foundation of modern camouflage theory. It was no longer about color, it was about perception, about disrupting the enemy's ability to decide what he was seeing. In that uncertainty lay victory. By the time the snows melted around Cassino, the Americans had turned dirt into doctrine, chaos into science. And somewhere beneath the dripping olive trees, a Sherman tank squatted motionless in the fog, its surface streaked with mud and chalk, its outline dissolving into the hillside. The Germans called it the Ghost of Cassino. The Americans called it what it was, just another tank trying to stay alive. The invasion of France began under a sky the color of pewter. From the decks of landing craft packed shoulder to shoulder, soldiers saw the cliffs of Normandy rise like a grey wall through the rain. The sea was cold, the light flat and merciless. Yet hidden in that haze was the quiet triumph of an idea born 15 months earlier in the Tunisian dust. The tanks waiting aboard the Liberty ships in the Channel were no longer the factory green machines of 1942. Every Sherman, every Churchill, every half-track landing on the beaches that morning wore what the Ordnance Department called MTO, dust pattern, a deliberately uneven blend of earth-toned paint and lime wash designed to mimic the accidental camouflage of North Africa and Italy. It was the first time in history that a military force had tried to mass-produce imperfection. The new paint was not uniform. Crews applied it with mops, rags, even brooms. It dried in streaks and blotches. Some tanks looked grey, others pale brown, a few with smears of chalk from hastily whitewashed barns. The result, when viewed from the air or the sea, was startling. The Allied armoured columns looked like the landscape itself, mud, sand and shadow fused into motion. In pre-dawn hours off Omaha Beach, the men of the 741st Tank Battalion stood in silence beside their amphibious DD Shermans, each machine covered with a thin film of sea mist that dulled the finish even further. Lieutenant Harold Best, commander of one of the lead tanks, later wrote, "They told us to make the paint uneven. I thought it was madness. Then I looked at the cliffs. Same color, same streaks. We didn't stand out, we blended in with the world." At H hour, when the landing craft dropped their canvas screens and the tanks churned toward the surf, the camouflage earned its first test under fire. German gunners in the pillboxes above the beach were expecting the dark silhouettes of armored vehicles against pale sand. Instead, through smoke and drizzle, they saw only motionless shapes that seemed to dissolve into the waves. When they fired, many shells struck short or high, their range estimates shattered by optical confusion. Not all tanks made it ashore. The rough seas swallowed many, but those that did became anchors of survival for the infantry. From the German vantage point on Point Etraz de la Percée, the scene below defied logic. Tanks that appeared and disappeared between bursts of smoke, their hulls reflecting the same dull sheen as wet sand. In post-war interviews, surviving Wehrmacht officers recalled ghost tanks rising out of the surf. Behind that illusion was the deliberate union of two forces, science and improvisation. The MTO dust pattern had been engineered by a collaboration between the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the British Camouflage Directorate. Its pigments were chemically designed to lose saturation after exposure to salt and rain, gradually fading into the color of local soil. The plan was simple. The longer a tank survived, the better hidden it became. The enemy, even if he adapted, would always be chasing a moving target. Once inland, the effect intensified. Normandy's hedgerows, dense, ancient walls of vegetation created a labyrinth of light and shadow. Crews quickly realized that movement, not color, gave them away. So they took the next step. Using ropes, netting, and strips of burlap dipped in mud, they festooned their tanks with hedgerow clippings, straw, and branches. The smell of crushed leaves and diesel became the new perfume of war. The Germans had never faced anything like it. Their doctrine of anti-tank defense depended on clear lines of sight and fast identification. The Allies had turned confusion into a weapon. German gunners began reporting moving bushes and hedge phantoms. The camouflage had crossed from practical to psychological. On June 12th, during the battle for Carentan, a platoon of Shermans from the 2nd Armoured Division ambushed a column of Panzer IVs at dawn. The German commander, Oberleutnant Hans Guder, survived long enough to describe what he saw. "We believed the road ahead was empty. Then the bushes opened fire. His entire column was destroyed in 6 minutes. Guder's report was captured days later and sent to Allied intelligence. It became proof of concept. The accidental camouflage born in Africa had matured into deliberate deception in Europe. Even the airmen noticed. Pilots from the 9th Tactical Air Force complained that they could no longer easily identify friendly armor. One flight leader radioed in frustration. "They look like the ground. Tell your tankers to wave something." The ground crews obliged, tying strips of colored cloth to radio masts for recognition. It was the only concession to visibility. Everything else remained dedicated to invisibility. But the success carried an ironic danger. Some Allied tanks were now so well camouflaged that infantry support units sometimes mistook them for wrecks. A British sergeant near Caen recalled walking past what he thought was a burned-out Sherman until it coughed smoke and began to move. He wrote later, "It was like the earth itself had decided to fight." By late June, the camouflage doctrine was formalized. Field orders instructed all armored units to maintain their environmental coloration. Tanks were to be repainted or dirtied, as the terrain demanded mud for rain, dust for dry roads, chalk for rubble. Even the maintenance manuals were revised. Page 37 of the new Vehicle Care in Combat pamphlet contained an unthinkable order for soldiers trained in peacetime discipline. Do not wash vehicles unless required for inspection or repair. German intelligence, watching from the other side of the hedgerows, could only guess at what they were facing. Some believed the Allies had invented a new type of optical coating, others suspected infrared deception. They were partly right. In London, physicist Dr. Reginald Victor Jones had indeed begun experiments on how varying reflectivity could disrupt range-finding optics. But the real secret remained far simpler: mud, chalk, and the refusal to look tidy. The power of that simplicity reached its zenith in the days after the breakout at Saint-Lô, when the U.S. Army poured into open country under blazing July sun. German pilots, hunting from the sky, found themselves blinded by the very earth they had once mastered. The fields shimmered with dust and haze, the tanks indistinguishable from terrain. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance photographs showed nothing but brown swirls and faint tracks. The report to Berlin was brief: enemy armor concealed by camouflage beyond countermeasure. In that moment, the philosophy born from desperation in Tunisia achieved its ultimate form. The American war machine, once mocked for being clumsy and loud, had learned to disappear. Its armor wore the land like a cloak. When the campaign in Normandy finally turned toward Paris, one tank commander summed it up best in his letter home: "We don't hide behind things anymore. We let the world hide us." The tanks that once gleamed under desert sun now rolled across Europe as moving pieces of earth, ugly, battered, and unseen until they struck. The Germans, who had once laughed at the flying milk bottles and pregnant cows of Allied design, no longer laughed at all. They had learned the final lesson of camouflage: visibility is defeat, and dirt is victory. The first snow came silently, settling on pine boughs and ruined roofs, masking the scars of months of war. By dawn, the Ardennes was white too white. Tanks that had blended with dust and mud now stood out like ink on paper. The camouflage that had made Allied armor invisible in Tunisia, Italy, and Normandy was useless under snow. The Germans saw the opportunity and took it. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the stillness broke. From the mist-shrouded woods of Belgium and Luxembourg came the thunder of artillery. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. The German counterattack struck the thinly held American lines with precision and fury. As shells burst among the trees, tank crews of the 4th and 9th Armored Divisions scrambled to reactivate their vehicles half buried in snow and mud. The enemy had learned from 2 years of humiliation. Panzer units now wore mottled whitewash, their tanks brushed with lime and soot in streaks that mimicked snowdrifts. The Allies, caught in the chaos of winter, had no time to repaint. For the first time since North Africa, they were the visible ones. Yet, within days, a familiar pattern of improvisation reappeared. It started, as before, from the bottom, from the crews. Outside Bastogne, a platoon from the 37th Tank Battalion found themselves surrounded by forest and snow. Sergeant Earl Red Coulson, a farmhand from Iowa turned tank commander, ordered his men to tear down barn doors from nearby villages. They smashed the boards into splinters, mixed the wood shavings with lime powder scavenged from a road crew, and rubbed the mixture across their tanks' hulls with frozen rags. When the sun rose, their Shermans looked like mounds of snow-covered earth. German patrols passed within 200 meters and never saw them. Word spread as fast as rumors do in war. Crews began experimenting with anything that dulled color bedsheets, flour, chalk dust, even white curtains from abandoned houses. One tank company near Street, Vith, wrapped its vehicles in parachute silk stripped from supply drops. Others used old tarpaulins coated with lime, patched together with rope and wire. From the air, these improvised disguises turned entire formations into patches of snowfield. The rebirth of camouflage under winter light was not just instinct, it was evolution. The army had already learned that adaptability, not uniformity, won battles. This time, the innovation received official sanction almost immediately. On December 20th, U.S. 12th Army Group issued a short directive. Use all available local material to reduce contrast of vehicles and guns against snow. No technical jargon, no paint specifications, just an order to vanish. At the same time, another kind of camouflage was taking shape far behind the lines an army built not of steel, but of deception. Officially, it was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Unofficially, it was called the Ghost Army. Formed earlier that year under General Omar Bradley's command, it was a secret unit of artists, radio technicians, and sound engineers trained to create illusions on the battlefield. By the winter of 1944, the Ghost Army's methods had matured into an art. Inflatable rubber Shermans light enough to carry, but convincing at a distance, were erected overnight to mimic armored columns. Trucks mounted with loudspeakers played recordings of tank engines, their roars echoing through valleys for miles. Fake radio chatter simulated entire divisions. It was camouflage turned inside out, not to hide, but to make the enemy see what wasn't there. During the Ardennes campaign, these tricks became weapons. Near Malmedy, the Ghost Army deployed 40 dummy tanks in a snowy clearing, while real armor repositioned 10 miles away. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the decoys, and German artillery shelled empty fields for 2 days. The illusion bought precious time for American units to regroup. For the first time, the Allies were not just concealing physical form, they were manipulating perception itself. The concept that had begun with dust and oil in Tunisia had now evolved into psychological warfare. Visibility was no longer about color, it was about belief. Meanwhile, the real tanks fought their own invisible war. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, sightlines were short, and muzzle flashes betrayed positions faster than color ever could. Crews began to think of camouflage as movement control, when to advance, when to halt, when to let the snow reclaim the machine. Lieutenant James Caldwell, of the 10th Armored Division, recalled, "We stopped painting and started listening. When you can hear them before they see you, that's camouflage." As the temperature plunged, mud froze into a hard crust that trapped sound and reflected light. Yet the tankers adapted again. They learned to cover exhaust ports with loose cloth to muffle the roar, to burn oil-soaked rags at night to mask their heat against infrared detection. Camouflage was no longer only visual, it was acoustic, thermal, psychological. By Christmas Eve, the counterattack had stalled. The sky cleared, revealing wrecked panzers and burned forests. But among the debris, German reconnaissance officers found something bewildering. Rows of American tanks, half covered in white, their outlines erased by snow, indistinguishable from terrain until you stood beside them. In captured reports, one officer wrote, "They have learned to hide even in light." The irony was profound. The same American army once mocked for its bright green machines and careless discipline had now become a master of invisibility. Its tanks could vanish in desert glare, in mountain fog, and now in snow. When the bulge finally broke in January 1945, the U.S. Army published its first manual on seasonal camouflage techniques. The preface credited field improvisations by armored personnel for their discoveries. Each page read like a hymn to pragmatism. Use dirt where there is dirt. Use snow where there is snow. The best camouflage is the ground itself. The Ghost Army, for its part, continued to fight without firing a shot, creating phantom divisions across the Rhine and into Germany. In its deception, it embodied the entire evolution of the camouflage story, from necessity to strategy, from survival to dominance. As the war dragged toward its end, the lessons of concealment crystallized into a final truth. Machines alone could not win wars. Men who could think like the land itself, who could read its colors, mimic its textures, and vanish within it, were the real architects of victory. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, amid white silence broken only by the hum of engines and the crunch of boots, a philosophy was born, that power is not in being seen, but in being unseen until the moment you strike. By the time spring came, and the snow melted into the dark soil of Belgium, the Shermans were caked again in mud, their whitewash peeling, their armor dull and battered. They looked as they always had when they were most dangerous, like the earth itself, waiting patiently for its next move. Spring came late to Germany in 1945. The forests around the Elbe River were pale and new, 1,000 shades of green after the long grey winter. Along the muddy banks near Torgau, the rumble of American engines echoed faintly under a sky streaked with smoke. The war was ending, but no one yet dared to believe it. By this time, the tanks that had begun the journey in the sands of North Africa were almost unrecognizable. Their olive-drab paint was buried under years of weather and war. Desert dust, Italian clay, French chalk, Belgian snow, and now German loam, no two were the same color. They carried their history on their armor, a living map of the campaign. The camouflage that had started as an accident had become the very identity of Allied armor, fluid, ugly, and unbeatable. On the morning of April 19th, a patrol from the 2nd Armored Division moved east through the ruins of a German village, its tanks half hidden by the morning mist. A sergeant named Frank De Luca wrote in his field diary, "The world and the tank have become the same thing. I can't tell where the mud ends and the steel begins." That line captured the truth of the final months. By the end of the war, Allied camouflage had evolved beyond paint or pattern. It had become philosophy. To survive, a soldier no longer needed to dominate the landscape, but to disappear into it. The German resistance, though desperate, remained dangerous. Jagdpanther and Panzerfaust ambushes waited in every forest and village. But something had shifted. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of open country, could barely find targets. Its reconnaissance flights returned with blurred photos where fields and tanks merged into one continuous pattern of mud and shadow. One final intelligence report from the German 12th Army lamented, "Enemy armor no longer observable until firing commences." This inability to see literal and symbolic marked the twilight of the Reich. German propaganda had promised omnipotence through vision, eagle-eyed observation, total control. But the Allies had built victory on the opposite principle, invisibility through adaptation. The mastery of camouflage was no longer confined to paint or terrain. Engineers now experimented with new coatings, rubberized compounds that reduced glare, fabrics treated to absorb radar pulses, and mesh nets embedded with foil to distort infrared sensors. It was a preview of a future science. What had begun as men smearing dust on steel had become the foundation of modern stealth. The most remarkable moment came when the Allies crossed the Rhine in March. Under cover of darkness and fog, pontoon bridges were assembled, without the Germans ever realizing the full scale of the operation. Camouflage netting stretched for miles, designed with patterns of alternating dark and light strips that mirrored the reflection of moonlight on moving water. Aerial reconnaissance later confirmed that the Germans had mistaken entire bridgeheads for natural riverbanks. On the ground, crews took camouflage further still. To disguise engine heat from thermal-seeking munitions, a rare but emerging threat, they draped wet canvas over their hulls, a primitive heat shield. At night, they burned smoke pots filled with oil and sand to create low-hanging haze, concealing convoys from both air and ground observers. Every trick, every smear of mud, was now part of a great improvisation that stretched across continents. When American and Soviet forces finally met on the Elbe, they met as ghosts. The tanks that rolled into the village of Torgau on April 25th seemed born from the earth itself. Local civilians later recalled that they appeared out of the mist, covered in dust and leaves, like forest spirits. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The war that had begun with flags and bright uniforms ended with armies that looked like the land they had fought through, camouflaged, colourless, and tired. The Germans surrendered not to dazzling machines of conquest, but to the quiet power of adaptation. In post-war interviews, captured Wehrmacht officers often mentioned American camouflage as one of the war's subtle but decisive advantages. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, told Allied interrogators, "Your tanks were never where we thought they were. Even when they were in front of us, they were not visible. You turned concealment into a weapon." After the guns fell silent, scientists and soldiers alike tried to understand what had happened. Reports flowed to Washington and London. The U.S. Army Quartermaster's Study. Field Concealment and Camouflage Practices. 1,942. 1,945. Compiled thousands of pages of data. It concluded that the most effective camouflage was not any standardized paint, but surface irregularity produced by natural accretion of environment. The perfect disguise was imperfection itself. This philosophy found new life in the post-war years. When NATO forces began rearming in the 1950s, their camouflage doctrine no longer came from factories, but from the lessons of men who had learned to hide in plain sight. The dusty, streaked Shermans of Africa had become the ancestors of the modern multitone patterns that still cover tanks and uniforms today. In Germany, the lesson was even more profound. Former Wehrmacht officers studying American tactics recognized that camouflage had reflected a broader truth about democratic warfare flexibility over rigidity, improvisation over ideology. One post-war analyst at the Bundeswehr Academy wrote, "They adapted faster than we could plan. Their camouflage was a metaphor for their society, diverse, chaotic, but unified when needed." Even in art and industry, the idea of controlled chaos began to echo. Post-war American automobile designers studied the flat finishes used on tanks to reduce glare, eventually inspiring matte paints and non-reflective coatings on civilian vehicles. Fashion designers borrowed the irregular blotches and patterns of military camouflage, turning survival aesthetics into style. The war's dirt and mud became symbols of authenticity. Back in the archives of the National War College, a faded memo from 1943 sits preserved in a file labeled Experimental Paint Application, Tunisia. It records the first field observation of a tank that had vanished behind nothing. No one could have known that this one line scribbled by a junior officer in a desert wadi would describe the beginning of a quiet revolution. In the end, the story of the accidental camouflage trick was not about tanks at all. It was about human perception, how the eye can be deceived, how the mind can adapt. The soldiers who rubbed limestone and dust on their armor did not think they were inventing science. They were simply trying to live another day. But in their desperation, they found something profound: the art of becoming part of the world you fight in, rather than standing apart from it. As the sun set over the Elbe that April evening, an American tank crew stood beside their mud-caked Sherman and watched Soviet soldiers approach across the river. They were all coated in the same dirt, the same exhaustion, the same grey camouflage of survival. One of them, Corporal De Luca, picked up a handful of soil and smeared it across the star on the tank's hull. He smiled faintly and said, "Guess this is the last coat we'll need." It was. The war had ended. The camouflage that began as an accident in the deserts of Tunisia had become the colour of peace, the quiet, earthy hue of men who had learned that sometimes the surest way to win is to disappear. The guns had fallen silent. Across Europe and the Pacific, a stillness spread that felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. On the morning of August 14th, 1945, word reached the front lines that Japan had surrendered. The war that had consumed the planet for 6 years was over. For most soldiers, the moment was not triumph but disbelief. They had lived so long in camouflage, hidden under netting, dirt, and fear, that stepping into sunlight felt strange. The habits of invisibility lingered. In photographs from those first post-war days, entire tank crews pose beside their machines not in parade gloss but in layers of grime, their faces indistinguishable from the armor behind them. The camouflage, like the war, had seeped into them. In the shattered cities and far-off jungles, armies began to strip away the disguises that had once kept them alive. Nets were folded, whitewash scraped off, mud washed away. Yet in doing so, something profound was revealed. Beneath the layers of dirt and paint was the story of human adaptation, a record of how soldiers had learned, instinctively and scientifically, to merge with their surroundings. It had begun in the Tunisian desert, when desperate tankers smeared dust on their armor to cut the glare. 2 years later, it ended on the plains of Germany, where entire divisions could move unseen across open country. The evolution of camouflage mirrored the evolution of warfare itself, from chaos to method, from survival to strategy, from improvisation to doctrine. After the war, researchers at the U-Bottes, Army's Camouflage and Deception Division, compiled their findings into a document titled Visual Concealment in Combat Operations, 1942-1945. The report ran hundreds of pages, filled with charts, photographs, and field notes. Its conclusion was simple but revolutionary. The human eye can be defeated not through invisibility, but through confusion. The best camouflage is motion disguised as stillness, color disguised as texture. This principle, born in the dust and refined through battle, became the foundation of post-war military science. The Cold War would take it further, into new dimensions of concealment, radar, infrared, sonar, and eventually the digital stealth of the modern age. Yet the essence remained the same. Every B-2 bomber, every stealth ship, every adaptive camouflage system owes its ancestry to that crude trick in Tunisia, when a frightened crew rubbed chalk and oil across their Sherman and vanished from sight. But in 1945, none of that was yet clear. For the men who had lived it, the meaning was more personal. Camouflage was no longer just paint, it was memory. At a demobilization depot outside Reims, France, Private William Hart of the 3rd Armoured Division was ordered to clean and repaint his tank before turning it in. He hesitated. The tank was layered in years of battlefield residue, Sicilian clay, Italian ash, French dust, Belgian snow. Every layer told a story. He wrote in a letter home, "They want us to wash it, but it feels wrong. Every scratch is someone's ghost." Allied tanks were gradually stripped back to factory sheen for peacetime service, but the crews never forgot what those ugly streaks had meant. They had learned that perfection attracted death, and imperfection meant survival. The factories would soon discover the same truth. In 1946, when Lockheed engineers began work on radar reflective coatings for jet aircraft, they studied wartime reports on diffuse surface reflection, the same phenomenon created by sun-baked dust on tank armor. The physics of invisibility, it turned out, had always been hidden in dirt. In Germany, British and American investigators examined captured camouflage manuals of the Wehrmacht. They were astonished to find that even in the war's final months, German engineers were still trying to replicate the American dust pattern that had confounded them since Tunisia. A faded entry from January 1945 reads, "Enemy vehicles appear to dissolve with background. Paint irregular. No standard color. Request research into similar effect." But by then, it was far too late. The war had moved faster than science. The Japanese, too, took note. In post-war interrogations, officers of the Imperial Japanese Army described how Allied tanks in Burma and the Philippines became part of the jungle, impossible to target beyond short range. One officer remarked, "They painted like ghosts. Their machines carried the color of our soil." It was a grudging tribute to an idea that transcended national boundaries, that survival favored those who adapted most completely to their environment. Even the civilians understood. In the ruins of Warsaw, Paris, and Berlin, children played among burned-out tanks still wearing their camouflage, streaked and patched with the memory of war. To them, These ghostly machines seemed not monstrous, but natural, like stones or trees reclaimed by the earth. Historians later debated whether camouflage had truly changed the outcome of battles. Some argued that industrial power and logistics, not paint, had won the war. Others pointed out that survival is the prerequisite of victory, and camouflage multiplied survival. Colonel James L. Donovan of the U.S. Ordnance Department summarized it best in his post-war lecture at Fort Knox. Logistics wins wars, but camouflage keeps logistics alive long enough to matter. By 1949, the art of concealment had entered the realm of science fiction. The newly formed Central Intelligence Agency studied wartime deception tactics for Cold War espionage. The Ghost Army's methods of sound and light became the prototype for psychological operations worldwide. From inflatable tanks in Europe to phantom radar signals in the Pacific, the idea of creating illusions out of nothing had become institutional. Yet, at its heart, the story remained human, a story of men kneeling in the dirt, smearing dust on steel because they refused to die. The elegance of the science that followed never erased the desperation of its beginning. In the archives of the U.S. National Museum of Armor at Fort Benning lies a single relic of that journey, a Sherman tank from the 1st Armored Division, its surface never restored. Its paint is cracked and faded, a mixture of brown, grey, and beige. Under magnification, researchers found traces of North African limestone embedded in the steel, a microscopic memory of the day it vanished in the desert sun. Visitors who stand before it often expect to feel awe at its size or power. Instead, they feel something quieter, a sense that this machine, more than any general or plan, embodied the war's greatest truth, that intelligence and instinct, when combined, can make even the heaviest thing on Earth disappear. When Private Hart finally boarded the ship home in late 1945, he carried one souvenir, a small tin of the chalk and oil mixture his crew had used in Tunisia. He kept it until his death decades later. On the lid he had written 4 words in fading pencil: "The color of survival." That, perhaps, was the final lesson of camouflage. Not how to hide, but how to endure, how to live long enough to see the world again when the fighting stops. For when the dust settled and the tanks stood silent, it was clear that the soldiers who learned to vanish had also learned, in the deepest sense, how to remain.